Hello, welcome to the Whispered Abyss channel. Happy viewing. Lena Parker's apartment was small, but it was her sanctuary. Located on the quieter side of the city, it was a perfect escape from the chaos of college life. The worn couch in the corner, the coffee table with books scattered around, and the soft light from the window filled the space with a comforting sense of solitude. The only thing that truly felt out of place was the antique mirror hanging on the far wall, a gift from her grandmother. It was old, with an ornate silver frame, and though it hadn't been touched in years, Lena couldn't bring herself to get rid of it. That morning, she woke up early, a habit she had developed in her college routine. The sunlight, barely peeking through the blinds, seemed to beckon her to get started with the day. As she walked to the bathroom to freshen up, she glanced at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. For a moment, it felt wrong. She brushed her hair back with one hand and noticed her reflection was a second behind her. It didn't move exactly when she did. A small delay, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a shiver down her spine. She stood frozen for a few seconds, watching the way her reflection seemed to lag behind. Her hand was still on her head in the glass while she had already lowered it in reality. Probably just tired, she told herself, shaking her head and brushing it off. She had been studying late into the night, and her mind was probably playing tricks on her. But as she leaned closer to the mirror, her reflection blinked at the exact moment she did. Not a second late, but in sync. Lena frowned. She had been awake for barely an hour, and this was too early for her to start imagining things. She turned away, but a creeping sense of unease followed her. The reflection, had it smiled? It couldn't have. She hadn't smiled. Just tired, she muttered under her breath as she finished getting ready. A voice on the other end of the phone snapped her out of her thoughts. It was James, her boyfriend. "Morning, sleepyhead. Are we still on for dinner tonight?" he asked, his voice warm and light. "Yeah, of course," Lena replied, her mind half on the phone and half on the strange feeling lingering in her chest. "See you later." She glanced back at the mirror one last time before leaving her apartment. It seemed normal now. No lag, no strange smiles. She shook her head again, a little embarrassed by her overactive imagination. But as she stepped out the door, the feeling stayed with her, gnawing at the back of her mind. Lena's day passed in a blur of classes, assignments, and brief moments of peace between her hectic schedule. By the time the evening came, she was exhausted. The city outside her window was just starting to glow with the fading sunlight, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She tossed her bag onto the couch, removed her shoes, and sighed with relief. It was a good thing she had dinner plans with James. A little time with him would help her forget about the strange moment she had experienced earlier. But the moment she walked past the mirror in the hallway, she froze. Her reflection didn't match her movement. It wasn't the usual slight delay that had bothered her earlier. No, this was different. As she passed the mirror, her reflection didn't just lag behind. It smiled. A wide, unnaturally broad grin spread across its face, even though Lena's own lips were pressed into a neutral line. Lena blinked, stopping in her tracks. She could have sworn she hadn't smiled, but there it was, her reflection grinning at her like it knew a secret. She leaned closer to the glass, scrutinizing her own face for any signs of a nervous twitch or a muscle involuntarily pulling the corners of her mouth upward. Nothing. She hadn't smiled. A shiver ran down her spine. "Maybe I'm just exhausted," she muttered, shaking her head and brushing it off. She turned quickly, her eyes darting back to the mirror, and the smile vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. Lena took a deep breath and stepped into the kitchen, hoping that a cup of tea would calm her nerves. But as she opened the cupboard to pull out her favorite mug, she saw something else in the corner of her eye. Her reflection was still there, smiling again. But this time, it wasn't just a smile. It was waving. She jerked her head toward the mirror, and for a split second, Lena's heart stopped. There, in the reflection, her hand was raised. It was her own hand, but she hadn't moved it. The reflection waved at her, slowly, deliberately, as though it was trying to get her attention. Lena's stomach twisted in knots, her breath catching in her throat. Her hand was still by her side. The reflection was a second ahead again, but it was waiting. "Okay, this is ridiculous," Lena muttered, her voice cracking slightly. She turned away, but as she walked toward the living room, the unease kept growing. She couldn't get rid of the sensation that something was wrong. Her mind raced. Maybe it was just the stress. Maybe she was imagining it. But deep down, she knew she wasn't. It wasn't just the mirror, it was her reflection. She grabbed her phone and sent James a quick message. "You still on for dinner tonight? I'm feeling a bit off." He replied almost instantly. "I'll be there soon, babe. Just relax. I'll bring your favorite dessert. You'll feel better." Lena smiled at the message, but the creeping dread never let go. She turned back toward the mirror one last time, half expecting to see the smiling, waving reflection still there. But it wasn't. The mirror looked just as it always had. Normal. Too normal. With a shaky breath, Lena turned away again. Her reflection was fine now, but somehow it still felt wrong. Dinner with James did little to ease Lena's growing unease. They ate at a cozy bistro downtown, but Lena found it hard to concentrate on their conversation. James was in his usual cheerful mood, joking about their classes and making plans for the weekend. But Lena couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, as though something was just out of her sight, lurking in the shadows of her mind. When James dropped her off at her apartment later that night, she gave him a quick, distracted kiss goodbye and headed inside. Her apartment, usually a place of comfort, felt oddly oppressive now. The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. Lena barely noticed the time as she went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. But as she walked past the hallway mirror, she froze again. This time, there was no delay in her reflection. It moved exactly in sync with her, but something was different. Something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't just mimicking her, it was staring. Not just looking at her, but staring with an intensity that felt almost alive. The eyes in the mirror seemed too real, too vivid. Lena's own eyes, usually a dull brown, looked darker, colder in the reflection. Without warning, the reflection grinned again. Not in the usual mischievous way, but in a way that felt predatory. The smile stretched too wide, revealing teeth that gleamed unnaturally. Lena recoiled, her heart pounding in her chest. It was as if her reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was its own entity, one that could think and act on its own. Before she could react, the reflection raised a hand. Not hers, but its own. Lena's own body stayed still, her hand frozen at her side, but the reflection's hand reached out toward the glass, as if it were trying to break through the surface. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear. Her reflection mirrored her every movement, backing away slowly, but the grin never faded. It stayed there, watching her, waiting. And then it happened. Lena turned away, her heart racing, but as she walked toward the living room, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. She whipped her head around in time to see her reflection move ahead of her. It was already standing in the hallway in the exact spot she had just been. It was no longer just a delayed response. The reflection wasn't just mimicking her anymore. It was ahead of her, anticipating her movements, as if it had become a separate entity altogether. Her reflection was taking her place. A wave of nausea swept over Lena, and she hurried out of the hallway, her steps frantic. She couldn't look at the mirror again. Not now, not ever again. Her mind raced. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. Maybe she was losing her mind. She felt dizzy, but she forced herself to focus. She needed to calm down. She needed to make sense of this. But before she could even think, the reflection appeared in her mind's eye, grinning again, that same malicious, chilling smile. And then she heard a sound, a low, almost imperceptible scraping noise coming from the hallway. Lena's breath hitched. She slowly turned her head toward the sound, her eyes wide, her pulse hammering in her chest. The scraping noise was followed by a faint whisper, like someone or something was calling her name. Lena. Her body froze, her hands trembling. The voice sounded familiar, but it wasn't James. It was something else, something she couldn't explain. She turned to the mirror, her heart in her throat. The reflection was still there, but this time it wasn't just smiling, it was waiting. Lena stood motionless in the living room, her body trembling as the faint whisper of her name echoed in her ears. She had to make herself move. She couldn't stay frozen like this, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The scraping noise came again, louder this time, followed by another whisper. It was no longer just a voice. It felt as though it was coming from within the mirror itself, as if her reflection were speaking directly to her. Lena, come closer. The voice was so eerily familiar, like an echo of her own thoughts. But it wasn't her voice. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she felt the overwhelming urge to run, to get as far away from the mirror as possible. But something in her also felt drawn to it, as if the reflection were pulling her in, beckoning her. Okay, this is insane, Lena whispered to herself, shaking her head as she turned away from the hallway. She had to break the spell somehow. She couldn't let this strange, horrifying experience control her. Her eyes darted toward the front door. She could leave, go to James's apartment, get away from this place. But a nagging thought stopped her. What if the reflection followed her? What if it came with her? Lena's breathing quickened as she fought the urge to panic. She couldn't think straight. She needed help. Maybe if she called someone, anyone, it would make this all feel real. But there was only one person she could trust right now, James. Before she could grab her phone, her eyes flickered toward the mirror again. And, once again, her reflection wasn't quite right. The grin was still there, wide and unsettling, but now the reflection's eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the hallway. It wasn't just mimicking her, it was aware of her, of everything she was thinking and feeling. Come closer, Lena. The whisper was clearer now, more insistent. Lena's feet shuffled toward the hallway without her consent, drawn toward the mirror like a moth to a flame. She reached out, almost involuntarily, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. The moment her hand made contact, a sharp jolt shot through her arm, like electricity coursing through her veins. Her breath hitched in her throat as she yanked her hand away, stumbling backward. The whispering stopped. Lena looked at her reflection, her heart pounding. For a second, It seemed to be just like before. Silent, still, lifeless. But something was different. The reflection was no longer smiling. It was waiting. Lena stared at it, her mind racing. What did it want? What was it trying to do? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that it had always been like this. There was something wrong with her reflection. Something that had been wrong from the moment she had seen that first delay this morning. But this was different. The reflection didn't just want to mimic her anymore. It was alive. It had its own mind, its own intentions. Then, as if it had read her mind, the reflection moved again. This time, it wasn't just a simple gesture like a smile or a wave. The reflection stepped forward, its image stretching unnaturally, as though it were about to crawl out of the mirror itself. Lena's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't her imagination anymore. Her reflection was trying to reach through the glass, as if it wanted to escape. Lena, let me in. Lena stumbled back, her legs hitting the edge of the coffee table. She was frozen in terror, unable to look away from the horrifying image in front of her. The reflection's hands pressed against the glass, palm out, as if trying to break free. Its eyes were wide now, frantic, desperate. She felt a pulse of raw fear shoot through her chest, and without thinking, Lena turned and ran. Lena ran, her heart hammering in her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She didn't know where she was going. She just had to get away from the mirror, away from that thing that was not her. She burst through the living room, the floor creaking under her feet as she hurried past the furniture. She couldn't stop. The fear was too overwhelming. A cold, suffocating weight that pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had to get outside. She had to leave this apartment, leave the reflection behind. But as her hand reached for the door handle, a sudden, chilling thought stopped her. The mirror. It had moved. It had reached for her. Her fingers froze over the door handle. She couldn't escape. Not really. The reflection, whatever it was connected to her, to this place. No matter where she went, it could follow. She spun around, her eyes frantically searching the apartment. The hallway was dark now, the light from the living room dimming as the shadows crept in. The air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. And then she saw it again. Her reflection. It wasn't in the mirror. It was in the hallway, standing there, smiling, waiting. But it wasn't just standing anymore. It was moving. The reflection stepped out of the hallway, its figure shifting unnaturally, bending as though it had become a shadow of itself, stretched too far. Its eyes locked onto Lena, and she felt a chill run down her spine. "Lena," the reflection whispered, its voice cold, more distant this time, as if it had already crossed into another world. "You can't run from me." The reflection didn't run after her. No, it didn't need to. It was the hallway now. It was everything. The walls, the floor, the door. Every corner, every surface. Lena was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. She stumbled backward, her pulse pounding in her ears. It was getting closer now. She could hear its footsteps, even though she knew it wasn't moving physically. It was in her mind, inside her head, chasing her thoughts, pushing them towards something she couldn't control. Her breath quickened as her panic surged. She tried to back up further, but she felt the oppressive weight of the reflection's presence closing in on her, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't think. She couldn't... A voice broke through the madness. A different voice this time. A real one. "Lena, it's me." Lena turned. her breath ragged, her eyes wide with confusion and terror. Standing in the doorway was James, his eyes filled with concern as he looked at her. What's going on?" he asked, stepping forward cautiously. "Lena, you're pale. What happened?" She blinked, disoriented. She wasn't sure what was real anymore. Was James real? Had he come to help her, or was this part of the nightmare too? "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The reflection. It's not me. It's trying to—" She didn't finish her sentence. The moment she looked toward the hallway again, she saw it. Her reflection was still there, watching them both. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just smiling anymore. It was mocking them. Lena's heart skipped a beat. This time, the reflection didn't just want her, it wanted both of them. "Lena, what's going on?" James asked again, his voice urgent as he stepped closer. He didn't seem to notice the reflection. How could he? It wasn't his nightmare, it was hers. Lena tried to focus, but her thoughts were racing, scattered. "James, look at the mirror," she finally shouted, pointing toward the hallway. There's something in there, something not right." James turned toward the hallway, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the mirror. But there was nothing. The mirror was empty, silent. His gaze flickered back to Lena, a mixture of concern and confusion on his face. "I don't see anything, Lena," he said softly, his tone now laced with uncertainty. "Maybe you're just tired, or, I don't know, stressed. You've been through a lot lately." Lena felt her throat tighten. She wanted to explain, to make him understand, but the words wouldn't come. How could she make him believe her when she wasn't sure she believed herself anymore? "Please, James," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "It's in there. It's not just a reflection. It's alive. It wants to take me." James stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder, trying to steady her. "It's okay. We'll figure this out. I'm here. I'll help you." But as he touched her, something changed. The moment his hand made contact with her, the reflection in the mirror shifted. It wasn't mimicking them anymore. It was alive, independent. It smirked at them, the grin widening to a grotesque, inhuman stretch. The eyes gleamed, glowing faintly with malice. Lena's stomach churned, her fear doubling. The reflection was no longer mimicking her movements. It was moving on its own. The figure inside the glass stepped toward them, as though it could step through the surface at any moment, the distortion in its body writhing like a shadow bending and twisting beyond the realm of possibility. "No, no, no," Lena muttered, stepping back, but James remained frozen, his hand still on her shoulder. "James, move, get away from it." But he didn't hear her, or maybe he just didn't believe her. His eyes were locked on the reflection, confused, but still convinced it was a trick of her mind. Lena shoved him aside with a strength she didn't know she had, her heart pounding in her ears. She had to stop it, but what was she supposed to do? How could she fight something that wasn't even real? Then the reflection spoke. "Lena." The voice was colder now, an icy whisper that sent chills down her spine. "I've waited for so long. Now, it's time." Lena's head spun. The reflection's smile widened, and for a split second, it looked like it was about to reach through the glass, its arm stretching unnaturally toward them. But then it stopped. "Don't worry," the reflection purred, its voice like silk. "You don't have to fight me. You don't have to run." Lena's eyes went wide with disbelief. What did it mean? What was it saying? "I can make this easy for you," the reflection continued. "I'll take your place, just for a while. You can live a life free of worry, free of fear, and, in return, I'll live your life for you. You'll get to experience everything through me. No more pain, no more fear, just peace. Lena's heart skipped a beat. It sounded too tempting, too good to be true. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. It wasn't a deal, it was a trap. No, Lena whispered, backing away, her hand trembling as she reached out toward James. Don't listen to it. It's lying. But the reflection only smiled, its expression softening as it took a step closer to the glass. It's not lying, Lena. Think about it. What's one little trade? You won't even remember. When I'm you, I'll be your better half. I'll be free of all the things that hold you back. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She felt the weight of the reflection's words pressing against her chest. What if it was right? What if everything she feared, everything she hated about herself, could just vanish? What if she could live the life she'd always wanted, without all the stress and anxiety? But then, in a sharp, instinctual moment, Lena shook her head. She couldn't give in. She couldn't. The reflection's smile faltered. It wasn't used to being denied. Very well, it hissed, its voice twisting with anger. If you won't take what I'm offering, then I'll take it from you. Lena's heart skipped a beat as the reflection's eyes glowed bright, a flash of light bursting from the mirror. The light from the mirror surged outward, blinding Lena. She stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest as her hands instinctively shielded her eyes. The reflection was no longer a mere image. It was something more, something alive, and it was reaching for her. The world around her seemed to tilt, the air growing thick and oppressive. A low, growling noise rumbled through the apartment, and the floor beneath her feet felt unstable, as though it were shifting beneath her. She tried to move, to escape, but her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as though the weight of the reflection's presence was dragging her down. "Lena!" James shouted, his voice strained with panic. But she could barely hear him over the roar of the mirror's power. The reflection was pulling at her, like an invisible force, and she felt herself being drawn toward it, her body moving without her consent. "No," she gasped, struggling against the invisible pull. She couldn't let it take her. Not now. Not like this. But the reflection's voice came again, sharper this time, like a blade scraping against glass. "You're mine now," it hissed. "You made the choice. You said no, but in the end, you'll realize you don't have a choice at all." Lena's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart thundering in her ears. She could see James, his face twisted with fear, but she couldn't reach him. The force was too strong. She had no control. "James," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Get out of here." But he didn't move. He was frozen, staring at her, at the reflection, and then back to her, as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. The fear in his eyes made Lena's chest tighten with guilt. He couldn't understand. He hadn't seen what she had seen. He hadn't felt it. And then the mirror warped, its surface rippling like water. Lena's vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment, she couldn't tell where she ended and the reflection began. The world spun around her, and she felt herself falling, her body twisting into a shape that didn't belong to her anymore. The last thing she saw before everything went black was James, his face stricken with horror, reaching for her, his hand never quite touching hers. When Lena woke, she was lying on the cold hardwood floor of the living room. Her body ached, her head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. She blinked, disoriented, and tried to sit up, but her body felt strange. Wrong. She glanced around. The apartment looked the same. The same worn-out furniture, the same dim lighting, the same creeping shadows in the corners of the room. But something was different. Something was very different. Her eyes flickered to the hallway. The mirror. It was gone. For a split second, relief washed over her. It was over. She had escaped. But then her stomach dropped. The reflection was gone. But was it really gone? The sound of footsteps echoed through the room, and Lena's pulse quickened. She turned toward the noise, her body tensing instinctively. And there, standing in the doorway, was James. Except it wasn't James. His eyes were wide, his face pale, and his mouth was twisted into a sickening grin. The same smile she had seen on the reflection. Her reflection. "Lena," he said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "I'm so glad you're awake." Lena's blood ran cold. The words felt wrong coming from him, as though they had been stolen from her lips, twisted into something that didn't belong. "James," she whispered, her voice shaking with disbelief. "What's going on? What happened to you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, the grin never faltering, and she saw it, the glint of something darker in his eyes, something other than James. "I'm not James, Lena," he said slowly, his voice low, seductive. "Not anymore. I'm something better." Lena recoiled, her heart racing. "What? What do you mean? What did you do?" The thing that looked like James tilted its head, as if considering her question. "You see," it said softly, "we've made a trade, you and I. I've taken his place, and now you're mine. No more running, no more hiding." Lena's breath caught in her throat. It was still here. It was the reflection. It had switched places with James, just like it had promised. It had become him. You're the reflection," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible, as if saying the words out loud made it all too real. The thing that looked like James smiled even wider. "I'm better than the reflection. I'm the one who's finally free. You, Lena, you're still trapped. But don't worry," it added with a tilt of its head. "I'll take good care of us." Lena's blood ran cold as she scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She had to escape. She had to get out of here before it was too late. But the door was still closed, and something told her that the outside world was no longer safe. She was no longer in control. The reflection had taken everything, and it was not done yet. Lena's mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over each other in a frenzied mess. She didn't have much time. The thing in front of her, this twisted version of James, was growing more confident with each passing second, its grin widening as it watched her struggle to comprehend what had just happened. "No," Lena muttered to herself, backing away slowly. "No, this can't be real." The thing that looked like James tilted its head to the side, eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "I told you, Lena," it purred, its voice dark and smooth. "You made your choice. I'm free, and now you're trapped." Lena's heart slammed against her chest as she spun around, her eyes darting to the window. She could hear the wind outside, the faint rustle of the trees in the distance, but everything felt off, as if the world had subtly shifted, and she no longer belonged to it. This wasn't her apartment anymore. This wasn't her life. "Please," she whispered, her breath ragged as she turned back to face the creature that had once been her boyfriend. "Please, let me go. Let me fix this." The reflection, James, laughed, the sound like glass shattering. "Fix it?" it repeated mockingly. "You think you can fix anything now? You've already given me everything I need. The body, the mind. I'll take care of the rest." Lena's chest tightened in horror. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She couldn't just give up. Not like this. Her mind flashed to the mirror, the only way this had started. Maybe, just maybe, if she could reach the mirror again, she could reverse it. It had to be the mirror. Without a second thought, Lena turned and sprinted for the hallway, her legs barely able to carry her as the panic threatened to overtake her. She didn't look back. Behind her, she could hear the creature following her, its footsteps slow and deliberate. The sound of its laughter made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. It was savoring this moment. "No use running, Lena," it called out to her, its voice echoing through the apartment like a sinister whisper. "You can't escape. I've won." Lena burst into the hallway and skidded to a stop in front of the living room mirror. It was gone. The glass that had once reflected her every move, her every flaw, her every fear, was now empty, bare. She could feel a cold chill creeping over her skin as she stared at the spot where it had once been. It was as if the mirror had never existed. Her breath caught in her throat. "No," she breathed, her voice hollow. "It's gone." The thing that used to be James appeared behind her, blocking her path. Its eyes were filled with cruel glee, watching her with an intensity that sent ice through her veins. "You don't need the mirror anymore," it said softly, its lips curling into a mocking smile. "I'm in control now. You can't undo what's been done." Lena's mind spun, but her desperation began to crystallize into focus. She needed something, anything, to fight back. She had been foolish, thinking that the reflection would remain trapped in the glass. But now, the battle had shifted. The reflection was free, and it had taken more than just her reflection. It had taken James, her life, her everything. Lena felt a sudden surge of determination. She wasn't going to let it win. Not like this. Turning sharply, she reached for the dresser by the wall, her fingers fumbling for anything she could use. Her hand grasped the edge of a book, and without hesitation, she lifted it and slammed it against the wall. The force sent the book tumbling to the floor, but in that instant, a glimmer of an idea sparked in her mind. The reflection had shifted through the glass, but what if she could shift something else? What if she could use the space, the distortion that had pulled her into this nightmare? Lena didn't stop to think. She grabbed the next object within reach, a small glass lamp, swinging it wildly as she turned back toward the creature in James's form. "Get away from me," she shouted, her voice raw and desperate as she threw the lamp at it. The glass shattered on impact, the pieces scattering across the floor like jagged stars. The thing that looked like James didn't flinch. It simply grinned wider, its eyes glowing with amusement. "Do you think you can defeat me with that?" it taunted. "I'm no longer bound by glass. I can't be stopped by your petty attempts." But Lena didn't stop. With every ounce of strength she had, she rushed at the creature. She had no plan, just a surge of adrenaline pushing her forward. And then, in a moment of clarity, she realized something. The reflection didn't need the glass to be alive. It didn't need the mirror to be real. It had already taken James's form, and in doing so, it had learned how to escape the rules of their reality. But the one thing it didn't have was her presence, her essence. Without thinking, Lena reached for her own reflection in the broken shards of glass scattered on the floor. She knelt down, feeling a surge of energy as she placed her palm against the sharp edges of the glass. For a split second, the world seemed to shift. Time slowed. The air grew heavy with anticipation. And then the mirror cracked. The creature in James's form froze, its expression faltering as the glass shattered further, splintering into 1,000 pieces. Lena could feel it. She could feel the grip it had on the world around her slipping. Lena's breath came faster as she stood up, her heart pounding. "You don't own me," she whispered to the thing before her. "I'm not giving up." And in that moment, everything went dark. Lena's eyes snapped open, but the world around her had changed. The apartment was gone, replaced by an endless void of swirling darkness, a coldness that chilled her to the bone. She couldn't feel the ground beneath her, couldn't see any walls or furniture. It was as if the very air had turned into an oppressive, suffocating mist. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to remain still, to breathe. The reflection had done this. It had pulled her into a place where reality had no hold, where the rules didn't apply. She was somewhere between worlds, caught in a space that was neither real nor imagined. A void, a nightmare. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Lena's stomach twisted with dread as she slowly turned toward the noise. And there it was, the creature, James. It was standing in front of her, his form no longer an exact replica of James, but something darker, more distorted. His eyes, no, its eyes were filled with malice, and the grin stretched unnaturally wide, too wide for any human face. "Lena," it cooed, its voice low and taunting. "Did you really think you could escape? Did you really think you could beat me?" Lena's fists clenched at her sides as she stepped back, her heart racing. "You're not James," she spat, her voice trembling but defiant. "You're just a reflection. You're nothing." The creature's grin faltered for a brief moment, but it quickly recovered, stepping closer to her with a slow, predatory pace. "I was never nothing," it said, its voice growing more guttural, more real. "I was always here, watching, waiting. You made a choice, Lena, and now we're together." Lena's mind reeled. The darkness around her, the void. It was as if reality itself had unraveled. She couldn't see where she was. She couldn't feel anything except the cold weight of it, the reflection pressing against her, suffocating her. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This isn't real. It can't be." But as she said it, the world around her began to shift. The darkness seemed to bend, to pulse as if it were alive. The reflection's laughter echoed through the void, sending a chill down her spine. "You still don't understand, do you?" it said, its voice now layered with echoes, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. "You're the one who called me here. You're the one who invited me in." Lena took a deep, shaky breath. She had to think. She couldn't let fear control her. She had been trapped in a nightmare before, but this was different. This wasn't just about fighting a reflection. This was about fighting for herself. She couldn't let it take her. With every ounce of willpower she had, Lena stepped forward, her voice strong despite the fear gnawing at her. "Number I didn't invite you in. I reject you." For the briefest moment, the creature faltered, its eyes flashing with something resembling confusion. And then, with an almost imperceptible flicker, the void around them began to warp. The swirling darkness began to ripple like water disturbed by a sudden wave. "What is this?" the creature hissed, its voice cracking with irritation. "No one rejects me. No one." But Lena could feel it. The power was shifting. She could sense the mirror, the real mirror, somewhere on the edge of her mind. It wasn't gone. It was just hidden, buried in this distorted space, somewhere beyond the creature's reach. In that moment, Lena knew what she had to do. She closed her eyes, focusing all of her energy on the broken shards of glass she had touched earlier, the mirror she had once known. The reflection didn't control her. Not anymore. She had to reclaim herself. The darkness around her began to pulse, as though it were alive, responding to her thoughts. She could hear the reflection's voice growing more frantic, but she shut it out. She reached deep into the void, into her own mind, pulling the pieces together, willing the mirror back into existence. "Come back to me," she thought. "I need you now." And then, without warning, the void cracked. The blackness split like glass, and before Lena could react, a rush of light exploded from the center of the void, illuminating everything around her. The mirror reappeared, its surface gleaming, its reflection steady and clear. The creature screamed in fury, its form writhing in the light. But it couldn't escape. It was bound to the reflection, and Lena had reclaimed it. Lena opened her eyes. She was back in the apartment, standing in front of the shattered mirror. The air was thick with silence, and the oppressive weight of the creature had vanished. She had done it. She had won. But even as she allowed herself a brief moment of relief, something nagged at her. The reflection had been powerful, and it had almost taken everything. Was it truly gone? Could it come back? Lena glanced at the shards of broken glass scattered around her feet. A single shard gleamed in the corner of the room, untouched by the chaos. She stared at it, the question lingering in the back of her mind. Was it over? She didn't know. But for now, at least, she had her life back. Lena stood motionless, staring at the shard of glass on the floor. A chill crept up her spine as her thoughts churned. The reflection was gone, for now, but there was something about that final scream, that furious anger that lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. Not yet. The apartment felt too still, too silent. It was as if the entire world had held its breath, waiting for something, anything to break the silence. Lena's hand trembled as she reached out and picked up the shard, its smooth surface cold against her fingertips. She stared into the glass, half expecting the creature to leap out at her. But nothing happened. The mirror was still, just a broken piece of what had once been whole. For a moment, she let out a shaky breath, allowing herself the relief she'd been craving. She was safe. But then something shifted. The shard in her hand began to tremble. The edges of the glass seemed to blur, and Lena's heart skipped a beat. She dropped it in alarm, stepping back as the glass slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the glass settling on the wooden surface. But then, from the darkness beyond the light, she heard it. A soft whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as Lena strained to listen, the words grew clearer, more distinct. Lena. Her breath hitched in her throat. She knew that voice. She recognized it. It was his voice, the reflection. "No," Lena whispered, her pulse pounding in her ears. "No, no, no." Her eyes darted around the room, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that the reflection was still here. But the room remained still, empty. Her pulse raced as she glanced back at the shard on the floor. The whisper continued, echoing in the stillness. "Lena, it's not over. You can't escape me." A shiver ran down her spine. She moved quickly, crossing the room to grab her phone, her hands shaking as she fumbled with it. She needed to call someone. She needed to talk to James, to someone, anyone, who could reassure her that it was just a nightmare. But when she unlocked her phone and saw the time, her stomach dropped. Hours had passed, but there was something else, something that made her stomach twist with fear. There, on the screen, was a notification, a message from James. "Lena, please, I think we need to talk." Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't spoken to James since that night, since she'd managed to escape the creature's grasp. How could he have known? She opened the message, her hands trembling, her mind spinning. The words were simple, but the meaning was chilling. "I think I'm seeing you in the reflection, Lena. It's different. I don't know what's happening, but I feel like something's wrong. Please, we need to talk." The air around her seemed to shift, and Lena's heart dropped into her stomach. The reflection hadn't been confined to the apartment. It hadn't been locked in the shattered mirror. It had followed her. It had found a way to reach out. And now it was trying to claim James. She couldn't let that happen. Not again. She had to stop it before it was too late. Lena ran to the door, grabbing her coat and slipping into her shoes without a second thought. She had to go to James. She had to make sure he was safe. She had to protect him from the reflection. The world outside felt cold and distant as she stepped into the street. The late evening sky overhead painted with shades of purple and gray. She barely noticed the cars passing by, her thoughts consumed by the message she had just read. Her hands gripped her phone tightly, almost as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. And then, just as she was about to step into the alleyway that would lead to James's building, her phone buzzed again. The message this time was even more cryptic. "Lena, it's happening again. The reflection, it's smiling at me. I can't—" The message cut off abruptly, and Lena's heart lurched. She didn't need to read the rest. She could hear the panic in his voice, feel the fear creeping through the screen. She had to get there, fast. But as she turned the corner, the streetlight above her flickered. Then everything froze. A shadow, tall and distorted, loomed in the distance. It stretched, twisting, as if it were made of the very darkness that surrounded it. Lena's blood ran cold as she slowly turned toward it. She saw him. James. But it wasn't James. Not entirely. His form was hunched, his features wrong. The reflection was already taking him, and as he raised his head, his lips curled into a grin that wasn't his. The same grin that had haunted her in the mirror. "Lena," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You're too late." Lena froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure in front of her, it was James, but it wasn't. The twisted version of him grinned, a grotesque and unsettling smile that stretched too wide across his face. His eyes were lifeless, hollow. The man standing before her was a parody, an imitation, something pulled from her deepest fears. Her reflection. "James?" Lena whispered, her voice cracking with disbelief. No, it can't be. The reflection, it, tilted its head, as if considering her words with mock amusement. It wasn't him. It was something else wearing his skin, using his voice. The same voice she'd grown to love, but now twisted, warped by the reflection's dark power. "I told you, Lena," the reflection murmured, its voice dripping with a mocking sweetness. "You can't run from me. You can't escape. I've been here the whole time, waiting. And now, I'm finally here." Lena's mind raced. She had to think. She had to get away from it. Him. But her body felt rooted to the spot, as if her feet were frozen to the ground. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee from the terrible thing before her, but her legs refused to obey. It was like the very air had thickened, weighed her down. She took a trembling step backward. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, and she realized the shadow wasn't just standing still. It was moving, closer with each passing second. The grin grew wider, its edges now jagged, as if it were trying to tear itself out of James's face. "No, stop," Lena choked out, feeling her voice break under the pressure. "Stop it. You're not James. You're not him. Let him go." The reflection's eyes glinted, flashing with cold amusement. It took a deliberate step forward, its distorted shadow swallowing the light around it. Lena could feel the ground beneath her feet tremble, as if the very earth was beginning to buckle under the weight of its presence. "Don't you see, Lena," it said, its tone low and cruel. "I am James. I always have been. I've just been waiting for you to let me in. And now I'm here, and I'm going to take everything. I'm going to take you." With that, it lunged. Lena didn't have time to react. She barely had time to register the movement before the shadow enveloped her. She screamed, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the alley, but it was too late. The reflection's form pressed into hers, a cold, oppressive force that stole the air from her lungs. She gasped, struggling for breath, her hands clawing at the dark figure that had taken James's shape. The world spun, the ground tilting beneath her feet, and Lena stumbled, falling into the cold embrace of the shadow. It was suffocating. Every breath felt like an effort. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. She was trapped. "No!" she screamed, trying to push away from the thing, but her arms were weak, her body too drained from the relentless horror of the past few days. The reflection's grip tightened, its form rippling, distorting as it wrapped around her like a vice. But then, something inside Lena snapped. The terror, the helplessness. It gave way to something else, a deep, simmering rage. She wasn't going to let it win. She wasn't going to let the reflection consume her, take everything from her. Not again. Not after everything she had fought for. With a cry of defiance, Lena shoved against the shadow with every ounce of strength she had left. The creature let out a hiss of frustration, its grip loosening just enough for Lena to break free. She gasped for air, her chest heaving. The shadow staggered back, its form flickering in and out of focus, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. Lena's mind raced. There had to be a way to defeat it. She couldn't just run again. She couldn't let it take over James completely. She had to find the source of its power, the thing that bound it to this world. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help her. Her gaze landed on the mirror shard she'd dropped earlier, still glinting on the pavement, a single piece of the broken mirror reflecting the streetlight above. Without thinking, Lena rushed to it, scooping it up in her hands. The shard felt cold against her skin, but it was sharp enough to cut through the air like a weapon. She held it up, staring at the reflection of the dark alleyway, and for a brief moment she saw herself. But it wasn't her, not exactly. The reflection in the shard was smiling. It was the creature, the reflection. But it wasn't just mimicking her. It was taking on a life of its own. "No," Lena whispered to herself, her heart pounding. "I'm not you. I am me." The shard began to hum, a strange, low vibration. Lena felt it resonating in her chest, pulling at her. Her reflection in the glass twisted and warped, becoming more monstrous, more twisted. But instead of feeling terror, Lena felt something else, a surge of power, of control. "I reject you," she breathed. "You're not me. You're nothing." The reflection in the shard screamed, its form shuddering violently. The streetlights above flickered, as if the world itself were rejecting it. Lena pressed the shard harder into her palm, and with a forceful cry, she thrust it toward the shadow. A burst of light erupted from the glass, blinding Lena. She covered her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. The reflection shrieked in fury, the sound echoing in the air. And then, in an instant, it was gone. When the light faded, Lena slowly lowered her hand. The alley was empty, silent. The shadow was no longer there. Lena collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. She couldn't believe it. It was finally over. The reflection was gone. But as she looked around, the emptiness felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. And in the distance, she swore she heard something. A faint whisper, too soft to understand, but unmistakably there. Lena's breath came in shallow gasps as she stood up, her knees weak and trembling beneath her. The reflection, the thing that had tormented her, that had taken on James's form, was gone. The shard of glass, still in her hand, felt like a lifeline, though she wasn't sure if it had truly ended. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. The alley remained silent, but the air felt thick, charged with a lingering sense of wrongness. It was as if the world around her was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The streetlights flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows along the pavement. Lena turned her head nervously, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. And then she heard it. A faint sound, like the softest tap of footsteps against the concrete. She stiffened, her heart lurching in her chest. Was it him? Was it the reflection, somehow finding a way back? Lena gripped the shard tighter, the cold metal cutting into her skin. But she didn't care. She was done running. She wouldn't let it take her again. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct now, drawing closer. Panic surged inside her as she turned, but the alley was still empty. Her breath quickened, her mind scrambling to make sense of the situation. The street was still empty. The night had swallowed everything whole. And then she saw it, her own reflection. It was standing in the broken window of a nearby store, not in the glass of the shard in her hand, but in the shattered storefront. Her own face stared back at her, but it was different. The expression on the reflection's face was twisted, sinister, its eyes dark and empty. A smile, too wide and far too knowing, spread across its face. It was a smile that sent a chill down Lena's spine. The reflection's lips parted. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" It whispered in a voice so familiar, so real that Lena's heart skipped a beat. It sounded like James, but she knew it wasn't. This wasn't him. This wasn't anything close to him. Lena took a step back, her body shaking as the reflection in the window moved. It mirrored her movements at first, but then it stopped. It didn't just mimic her, it stared at her, its gaze piercing. The smile grew wider, stretching impossibly across its face, and for the first time, Lena realized something terrifying. It wasn't just mimicking her, it was learning from her. Every thought, every movement, everything Lena had done to try and fight it, the reflection had seen it all. It knew her. It had learned her fears, her doubts. It had become her. Her pulse quickened, the reality of her situation crashing down around her. She wasn't just fighting a shadow, she was fighting herself. The reflection, the thing that had haunted her, was now more powerful than ever. It had been feeding on her fears, her weakness. "No," Lena gasped, shaking her head. "You're not me. You can't be." The reflection in the window tilted its head, as though it were amused by her desperation. Its eyes glinted, and the smile turned into something darker, something malicious. "You are me," it said, its voice low and mocking. "You've always been. And now we're going to trade places." Lena's stomach twisted. "No, I'm not you. I'm not—" Before she could finish, the reflection stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. The glass in the window seemed to ripple as it reached out, its hand stretching toward Lena with a sudden, violent speed. Lena screamed and staggered back, but it was too late. The reflection's hand shot through the glass like it wasn't even there, grabbing hold of her arm with a vice-like grip. "No!" Lena cried out, struggling to free herself. She twisted her body, trying to pull away, but the reflection's grip only tightened, its fingers cold and unyielding. And then the glass shattered. The world around her exploded in a blinding flash of light and shards of broken glass. Lena fell to the ground, the shard still clutched in her hand. But before she could react, the reflection, it, was on top of her, pressing its cold, dead hands against her chest. It wasn't just standing there. It was pushing her down, forcing her to the ground. Lena gasped for air, her chest heaving with panic, but she couldn't move. The pressure was too much. The reflection leaned closer, its grin now so wide, so unnatural, that it seemed to stretch beyond its face. "You're mine now," it whispered, its voice a cruel echo of her own. "I've waited so long for this." In that moment, Lena felt a sharp, searing pain in her chest, like her heart had been ripped from her body. The world spun around her as she fought for control, but the reflection was too strong. Its form seemed to warp, its features shifting and blending with hers. For a second, just a moment, Lena felt something inside her crack, something deep and dark. She could feel it, the other part of her, the part that had been trapped all this time, locked away in the reflection. It was awakening, stirring within her. But no, she refused. She couldn't let it win. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Lena gripped the shard tightly and thrust it into the heart of the reflection. The figure screamed, a sound that pierced the air like a knife, and the grip on Lena's chest loosened. The reflection reeled back, its face contorting in agony as it began to unravel, its form flickering like a dying flame. Lena gasped, her body weak from the battle, but she didn't let go. She pressed the shard deeper until the reflection's face vanished entirely. The air went still. Lena collapsed onto the cold pavement, her body trembling, the shard slipping from her hand. The shattered glass glittered around her like a million tiny stars. She could barely breathe, but she felt something deep within her, a sense of victory. It was over. The reflection was gone. Or was it? Lena closed her eyes, exhaustion washing over her. But even as she tried to relax, there was one thought that lingered in her mind. A thought that made her blood run cold. What if it was never really gone? Lena lay there, the cold pavement pressing against her skin, her mind buzzing with exhaustion. She tried to push the haunting thought aside, the one that told her it wasn't truly over. But every time she closed her eyes, she could feel it. The reflection. It wasn't gone. It couldn't be. Her fingers twitched as she slowly began to sit up, her body aching with every movement. Her head throbbed with the pressure of the fear, the confusion, the endless terror she had lived through in the past days. She had faced the reflection, defeated it, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The alley was silent again, the distant hum of the city's nightlife the only sound. The glass, the shards, and the remnants of her shattered reality lay around her like a cruel reminder of everything that had happened. Lena stared at the jagged pieces of glass, her hand trembling as she reached for one. She was about to rise to her feet when she noticed something strange. A piece of glass, larger than the rest, shimmered with an odd light. It wasn't reflecting the street lights. It wasn't catching the usual gleam from the broken windows of nearby buildings. No, this glass was alive. Lena's breath hitched. She couldn't tear her gaze away from it, as if it were pulling her in. It was a piece of the reflection. She had never seen it before, yet it seemed so familiar, like a part of her that had been ripped away. Slowly, as if possessed by some force, she reached for it. Her hand hovered above the shard for a moment, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The reflection had been twisted, broken, yet now it seemed to call to her, whispering in the silence of the night. "Don't touch it. You don't need to go back." But Lena couldn't stop herself. Her fingers closed around the shard, and as soon as she did, a violent jolt shot through her body. The world around her blinked, flickered, and she felt it again, like the reflection had entered her, like it was inside her mind, twisting and turning in places it had no right to be. Her vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment she wasn't sure where she was anymore. Was she still in the alley? Was she still alive? The air around her seemed to warp, bending, distorting like a funhouse mirror, and then she was back in the living room. The dim light of her apartment flickered weakly overhead. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around. Nothing had changed. It was as if the past few days had been a dream. But then her eyes flicked to the mirror. There, standing in the reflection, was her own face. Only it wasn't the Lena she knew. The reflection was smiling at her, that same wide, twisted grin. The eyes were hollow, empty, as though something was watching her from behind them. No, Lena thought. No, this is it. I won't fall for this again. But as she stepped closer, the reflection didn't just smile. It winked. It winked, as though it knew exactly what Lena was thinking. Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place. There was something wrong. She couldn't stop it. She couldn't escape it. "You thought you could be free." The reflection's voice came from the mirror, soft and mocking. It wasn't just an echo of her voice anymore. It was different, distorted, like a symphony of broken tones. "You thought it was over." Lena stepped back, her heart pounding wildly. She backed away from the mirror, but the reflection followed her. It mimicked her movements, but each time it did, it seemed to grow more real, more alive. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She spun around to leave, but as she turned her back, the reflection in the mirror spoke again, its voice deeper now, almost intimate. "You'll never be free, Lena," it whispered. "You are mine." Lena's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor. The reflection had crossed the line, stepping through the glass, through the barrier, into her world. Her mind raced, thoughts tumbling over each other. She had defeated it before. She had fought it back. But now it was here, with her. The door creaked open behind her, and Lena's heart froze. She couldn't look away from the mirror. She knew what would be there. She could feel it. She had no choice but to turn around. And when she did, standing in the doorway was James. He was staring at her with wide, frightened eyes, the same terrified look he had when he first encountered the reflection, the same look she had worn in her darkest moments. "Lena?" His voice trembled as he took a step forward. "Lena, what's going on? What's wrong?" Lena couldn't answer. She couldn't even speak. All she could do was stare at him, and at the reflection that wasn't James. The reflection was no longer alone. It was standing beside him now, mimicking his movements exactly. But, unlike James, the reflection was smiling. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and Lena could feel it, deep inside her, taking root once again. She wasn't free. She never would be. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His face softened with confusion, but before she could say more, the reflection stepped forward, its lips curling into a grin. "This is the last time, Lena," it said, its voice full of cold certainty. "You're mine now, and so is he." Lena's body shook as her vision blurred, her breath shallow. She had escaped once, but it had always been there, lurking in the glass, waiting for her to make the wrong move. And now, the reflection was all around her. Lena's breath came in short gasps as the reflection stepped forward, its hollow eyes fixed on her, its smile growing wider and more sinister. James, still standing in the doorway, looked between Lena and the reflection, his confusion turning into palpable fear. He took a step back, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Lena, what's going on?" he asked, his voice shaky. "What's happening to you?" But Lena couldn't answer. Her mind was a chaotic mess, her heart thumping in her chest, as though it were trying to escape her body. She felt trapped in a nightmare, suffocated by the cold air that seemed to surround her. The reflection's eyes gleamed with a malice that sent shivers down her spine. "You don't understand, James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's never over. It's always there, waiting." The reflection mirrored her, its grin stretching impossibly wide. It turned its attention to James now, a mocking glint in its eyes. "You shouldn't be here, James." The reflection spoke in a voice that wasn't quite Lena's, but eerily close. "You don't belong here." James took another step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the doorframe, as though trying to escape. But the reflection followed his every movement, its eyes never leaving him. "Lena, I don't know what this is, but you have to let me help you," he pleaded, his voice growing more desperate. "We can figure this out. We can—" Before he could finish, the reflection's smile twisted into something even darker, something that chilled Lena's very soul. "It's too late for that," it said, its voice suddenly harsh, distorted. "Lena is mine now, and you're just part of the game." She could hear it now, a faint whisper in her mind, like 1,000 voices overlapping. "Come closer. Join me. You are mine." "Stop!" Lena shouted, her voice breaking. "Leave him alone." But the reflection ignored her, its gaze fixed solely on James, who was now frozen in place, staring at the reflection with wide eyes. "You have no idea how long I've been waiting for this moment," the reflection said, its voice dripping with malevolence. "Lena was always mine. She just didn't know it. But now you're all part of my world." Lena's mind reeled. She tried to move, to break free from the suffocating presence of the reflection, but her body refused to obey. It was as if the reflection had taken hold of her, pulling her into its web. She could feel it, deep inside her, the weight of its influence, its power over her. James stumbled back, his hands raised defensively, his eyes still locked on the reflection. "What are you talking about? What do you want from me?" The reflection's smile widened, its face contorting in a grotesque display. "I want everything," it said, its voice low and venomous. I want Lena. I want you. I want this entire world to bend to my will." Lena felt a wave of panic wash over her as the reflection's words sank in. It wasn't just trying to take her, it wanted everything. It wanted them, her and James, and it wouldn't stop until it had consumed them both. She had to fight back. She had to do something. With every ounce of strength she could summon, Lena forced herself to move, her legs trembling beneath her as she stumbled toward the mirror. She had to destroy it. She had to shatter the reflection once and for all. But as her fingers touched the cold surface of the mirror, something horrible happened. The reflection twisted, contorted, and then it stepped through. Lena gasped, stumbling backward as the reflection emerged fully into the room. It was no longer just an image. It was a living, breathing entity, its eyes glowing with malice, its grin stretching too wide to be natural. "No!" Lena screamed, her heart racing as she backed away from the monstrous figure now standing in front of her. James, who had been frozen in place, suddenly snapped into motion. He lunged toward Lena, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her away from the reflection. "Lena, we have to go," he shouted, his voice urgent. "Now. We have to get out of here." But it was too late. The reflection's form began to shift, its body twisting like liquid, like smoke. It was no longer human. It was something else entirely. Something dark, something unnatural. "You can't escape," the reflection hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "I've already won." Lena felt the air grow colder, the walls of the room seeming to close in around her. She could feel the reflection's presence pressing in on her, suffocating her, choking the very breath from her lungs. "James," she whispered, her voice cracking. We're trapped." James's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I won't let it take you," he said, his voice firm despite the terror in his eyes. "I won't let it take either of us." The reflection laughed, a sound that sent chills down Lena's spine. "You don't have a choice," it said, its voice now an echo that seemed to come from all directions. "This is my world now, and you're both going to be a part of it." As the reflection advanced toward them, Lena's mind raced. She had no way out, no escape. But then, in the corner of her eye, she saw something, a glimmer of light. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she spotted the faint glow in the corner of the room. It wasn't much, just a flicker like a distant star in the dark, but it was enough to spark a fleeting sense of hope in her chest. She didn't have much time, but something in her knew that this was the key. "James," Lena whispered, her voice trembling but urgent. "The light. Over there. It might be our way out." James, still gripping her arm tightly, glanced in the direction she pointed. His eyes narrowed, trying to focus through the thick, oppressive air. The reflection, meanwhile, was advancing slowly, its smile still twisted in mockery. It seemed to revel in their fear, savoring the moment before it claimed them. I don't see anything," James muttered, his voice tight with panic. Lena felt the chill of the reflection growing closer, its presence weighing heavily on her shoulders. She didn't have much time. If she didn't act now, they were both doomed. The reflection was relentless. She could feel its cold breath on her skin, hear its voice swirling in her mind, demanding to be let in. But the light, it was their only chance. Summoning every last ounce of willpower, Lena broke free from James's grasp and stumbled toward the glowing spot in the corner. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, her body heavy and sluggish, but she pushed on, ignoring the dread creeping up her spine. The reflection's voice, now a low growl, echoed behind her, mocking her attempt to escape. "Do you think you can outrun me?" The reflection taunted, its voice dripping with malice. "You cannot escape what you are. You belong to me." Lena's hand reached out, brushing against the source of the light. For a moment, there was nothing. The air grew colder, darker, until, with a sudden crackle, the light intensified. A strange, warm energy surged through her fingertips, and for a brief second, she felt a rush of power, a sense of clarity amidst the chaos. "James!" Lena shouted, her voice clear and strong. "Get over here, now." James hesitated for only a moment before rushing toward her, his face set with determination. But before he could reach her, the reflection lunged, its long, shadowy arms reaching toward him. "No!" Lena cried out in desperation, her hand tightening around the light source. The energy surged again, this time pulsing through her entire body, filling her with a strange, unfamiliar strength. With a sudden, furious shout, Lena yanked the light from the corner, swinging it toward the reflection. The moment it made contact, a shockwave of energy erupted from the light, blasting the reflection backward. The air vibrated with an otherworldly hum, and Lena's mind seemed to break free from the reflection's grip, for the first time in what felt like forever. The reflection screeched in agony, its body contorting violently as it was pushed back, its face twisting into a grotesque mask of fury. It tried to advance, but the light pushed it further, the force of its energy undeniable. Lena's breath came in sharp bursts as she held the light steady, her arms shaking with the effort. She could feel the power surging from the source, radiating through her, into the very fabric of the room. The reflection, once unstoppable, was now writhing in pain, its form destabilizing, flickering like a broken image. "Lena, I don't understand." James gasped, his voice full of awe and fear. He stood behind her, eyes wide as he watched the reflection struggle against the light. "You need to trust me," Lena said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "This is the only way. I'm not going to let it take us." The reflection, now a distorted, broken version of itself, let out a final, terrifying scream. Its features blurred and shifted, becoming something monstrous, something far worse than Lena had ever imagined. It reached out with a hand that seemed to stretch unnaturally, its fingers like dark, jagged claws. Lena's hand trembled as she pressed the light forward, the energy intensifying. The reflection's clawed hand came within inches of her face, its voice an unintelligible hiss, but before it could make contact, the light exploded in a burst of energy, so bright that it seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality itself. And then, everything stopped. The room went still. The oppressive cold dissipated, replaced by a strange, heavy silence. The mirror, once a gateway to the reflection's malevolent world, now lay shattered, its pieces scattered across the floor like jagged fragments of a nightmare. Lena and James stood in the center of the room, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. The light had vanished, leaving only the echoes of its power behind. "Is it over?" James whispered, his voice trembling. Lena didn't answer immediately. She looked around, her mind still reeling from the events that had just transpired. The reflection, the doppelgänger, was gone, but something lingered. A faint memory, a feeling in the pit of her stomach that the darkness wasn't truly gone. It might be over for now, but Lena knew, deep down, that she would never fully escape its presence. The mirror, once a gateway, was nothing more than shards at their feet. But as Lena glanced at James, She could see the same understanding in his eyes. They had both changed, and no matter where they went next, the nightmare would haunt them forever. Lena took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest, but she was resolute. The reflection might have been defeated, but she wasn't sure if the battle was truly over. "We need to leave," she said quietly, her voice firm, "before it comes back." James nodded, the fear in his eyes giving way to a resolve that matched her own. Together they stepped toward the door, leaving the room behind, along with the remnants of the reflection. But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't finished with them yet.